Now we're going to start. Today's daf is Mem Dalet. We're going to start from the Mishnah, which is about 6 lines down from the top of the page. Mitaltalin ner chadash v'lo yashan. This is getting into the laws of muktzeh, and primarily is going to deal with that for a little while. Of course, we moved from the subject of leaving things on the fire to a flame burning and what the status of it is, and now we're talking about the issues of muktzeh in terms of a lamp or a candle. Now, when we talk about a candle, what we're talking about is the container into which the oil would be placed, and then a wick would be placed in the oil. So that's what, when it talks about ner, it's not talking about like a wax candle like we think of. It's talking about a cup that contains oil, and into the oil is placed a wick. So it says you can move on Shabbat ner chadash, a new candle. And again, we're not talking about a wax candle. A wax candle, nobody would not be the same, because a ner chadash here means you got a cup at the store, okay, that could be used to fill with oil and burn a candle. But it's not a candle like the way we think of a candle. We think of a candle as a solid wax entity that has a wick embedded in it. Okay, that's not what they're talking about. That would be a different issue. Here we're talking about just a cup. And since this cup could theoretically be used for more than one thing, not just for lighting a fire, but it could be used for drinking some soda or whatever, because it's a ner chadash, it was never used before. So it hasn't become disgusting or ruined yet. It's got multiple use. Okay, so that's why you're allowed to use it. Avalo yashan, but not an old one. Why not? Because the earthenware cups that they would use for oil lamps would absorb the oil and become pretty disgusting, for lack of a better word. What's called mi'us. It's called mechamat mi'us, something which is distasteful. Nobody would want. Once you've used one of these cups to burn oil in it, you're never going to want to use it to have your tea again. Let's put it that way. It's going to be distasteful. So therefore, you can't move it. That's what the Tanakama says, who turns out to be Rabbi Yehuda, as we're going to see. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says, Kol nerot mitaltalin. Now remember, Rabbi Shimon is always lenient about muktzeh. We find this theme again and again. He's lenient here as well. He says you can carry any nerot that you want, even the ones that have been used before, because he says that if you have a purpose for it, it's not muktzeh. If you have a need for it, it's not muktzeh. I can't judge and tell you it's mi'us, right? It's mechamat mi'us. It's something which is disgusting, and because it's ma'us, because it's something distasteful, you can't touch it. Who am I to tell you what's distasteful? Yeah. You want to drink from your soda? Right. Soda from there? This is not my problem.
What may be disgusting to you may not be
exactly.
So much.
Yeah. One man's disgusting is another man's delicacy. Who knows? Okay. Yeah, exactly. Or herring. Forgot. Yeah. So that's a better example. Chutz min hanera dolek b'Shabbat, except for a candle that's lit on Shabbat itself. In other words, if one actually lit this candle on, and this candle is burning right now, you cannot move the burning candle that's burning at this moment, according to Rabbi Shimon. That's the limit. In other words, he's so liberal about muktzeh that the only time he tells you can't move a candle is if it's actually burning right now. Because if it's actually burning right now, not because of muktzeh, but because we're concerned it might go out. That's the only reason, and then you'll extinguish it. So it's a gezerah because we're concerned you might extinguish it. So the Gemara brings now a Tosefta that gives us a couple of additional opinions and expands upon it a little bit. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, mitaltelin ner chadash, aval lo yashan. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So now we can recognize that as the opinion of the Tanakama, the first opinion in the Mishnah that we just read. You can move a new candle, but not an old candle. And again, we're not talking here about a wax candle, we're talking about just the cup. So since the cup has never been used, one could use it for any purpose that one wishes. But if it's already been used, it's not going to lend itself to that use anymore. Rabbi Meir says, Kol hanerot mitaltalin, chutz min haner shehidliku bo b'Shabbat. This is a third opinion that was not reflected in the Mishnah. Rabbi Meir says, if you use the candle on this Shabbat, in other words, it was lit on Friday, it eventually extinguishes, and then Shabbat morning you say, you know what? The oil is burnt out of it. I'm going to use it for my coffee. Right, whatever, anything. You want to use it. So Rabbi Meir says, as long as it's no longer burning, go ahead, use it if you want. So what does that mean? He doesn't hold of this concept of muktzeh mechamat mi'us. He doesn't say that something which is disgusting, so to speak, is no longer able to be used. Repugnance. Okay, that's the word that they use. Okay, repugnance is okay, same thing. The word disgust, repugnance, same thing, pretty much. Repugnance sounds more of like a principled. Yeah, you just want to do some fancy multi-syllabic words. Thank you. So It means that it's distasteful. So, and anyway, he doesn't. Apparently, Rabbi Meir doesn't. So there are two issues operating here. One is called muktzeh mechamat isur, that if something was involved in a prohibition, for example, you lit a candle, so that candle can't be moved now because it's burning on Shabbat. That's the reason. So now even when it extinguishes, you might raise an issue and say, well, since it was prohibited to be moved before because it was lit, now you shouldn't be able to move it either. But Rabbi Meir doesn't consider that a problem. If the candle has extinguished, it's no problem. The other issue that Rabbi Yehuda raises is that it's mechamat mi'us, that since it became disgusting or distasteful from absorbing the oil, now you won't want to use it for anything else. And because it's distasteful, therefore it's muktzeh for that reason. It's not going to be something you would have in mind to use for that reason. So Rabbi Meir doesn't buy that either. Okay, so he is lenient on two things. Rabbi Yehuda is stringent about them and he's lenient about them. And now we have Rabbi Shimon Omer, Chutz min hanera dolek b'Shabbat. I disagree even further. Okay, because Rabbi Meir said, I'm sorry, I misspoke, right? Because Rabbi Meir says that if you used it that Shabbat, you can't use it. In other words, he agrees with mechamat isur. Right? I was saying Rabbi Shimon for Rabbi Meir. Right? So Rabbi Yehuda says there are two problems. One is you lit it on Shabbat, that's no good. The other one is, so once you've lit it on Shabbat, you're already saying, I don't want this for Shabbat. The second is it becomes disgusting as a result of being used. So those are two issues. Rabbi Meir says, I agree with you that if you lit it on Friday, that it's no good. Once you've lit it, you've already said, it's prohibited for me to use and I don't want anything to do with it and I'm leaving it till after Shabbat. But I don't agree that if it extinguishes, in other words, that if you used it last Shabbat and now you want to use it this Shabbat and you haven't used it for lighting this Shabbat, in other words, you just want to use it as a cup this Shabbat, I disagree that the fact that it's disgusting makes it disqualified. I think you can use a disgusting thing if you want to. You just can't use a candle that was lit on this particular Shabbat. Why? Because at the beginning of Shabbat, it was prohibited to be handled because it was lit, and now it's extinguished, but you still can't use it.
Because the intention was for this specific.
Yeah, the intention was I don't want it because I'm lighting it. But if you lit it last week and it burned out and you cleaned it or whatever, and it's still disgusting because it absorbs the oil, that I'm not worried about. Rabbi Meir says, and Rabbi Shimon comes along and says, you know what? I'm not even worried if you lit it this Shabbat. Even if you lit it last night, it was Friday night, and then this morning it was burnt out and it extinguished, and you want to use it for your tea, no problem. Even though you lit it that Shabbat. So that's where the machloket is between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda has two things he's stringent about. Rabbi Meir agrees on one, that if you lit it that Shabbat, you can't use it for that Shabbat, even if it's out now. Rabbi Shimon is saying even if you lit it that Shabbat, as long as it extinguished, I don't care.
It was the tea. It was oil.
I know, but you don't want the oil. You want to use the cup.
He wants to use it as something else.
The cup. You want to use the cup. Yeah.
Sounds like a losing argument.
Yeah, and then the last opinion is, but then it says kavita mutal taltala. If it extinguishes, you can use it according to Rabbi Shimon. Aval kos v'karav ashashit lo yizizeh mimukomam. The Gemara is going to explain this in a second. But a cup or a plate or a large glass, you can't move them at all. We'll see why does Rabbi Shimon agree in the case of a large glass. Why should that make a difference? Okay, for Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon's son says, Omer mistapek min hanera kabeh umin hashemen mitaftef va'afilu v'shashan ner dolek. So he goes really far. He says, you know what? You can take, even if it's still lit. So he says, first of all, if it went out, you can take even the oil from there, no problem. And even if it's still lit, if it's dripping and you catch some of the oil, you can even use that. No problem. So he goes really far. Rabbi Shimon would say, as long as it's lit, you can't have anything to do with it. Okay, now that it extinguished, that's fine. His son says, you know what, go over there and if you could catch some oil in your hand, you can't take it out because that's considered participating in extinguishing the candle. You can't draw it. But if it falls on the side, you take some. No problem. Well, he's taking it even further.
With the egg.
That's true. That's true, but Rabbi Shimon's son is having an even more lenient opinion than we've seen before. This is the most lenient we've ever seen. Yeah. No, Rabbi Shimon. No, Rabbi Eli. This is. Oh, you mean yes, Rabbi Shimon of Muktzeh, yes.
But his son was Rabbi Elazar. Why not come Rabbi Eliezer?
Why does it say Rabbi Eliezer? Let's see. Does it say on the side another version? It's a good question. Yep, it says It says in the notes here. It should say Rabbi Elazar. So you're right.
Where is the note?
I have notes on mine of corrected manuscripts on the side and the bottom, and you're right. It's Rabbi Elazar. It's Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. You're right.
Is he the one?
Yeah, he's the one that wanted to burn up the world, but not with this candle. This candle you can. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, you're right. Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Shimon is correct. So now we move forward. So Amar Abaye says, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon savar la kavua b'chada v'paliga leb'chada. He agreed with his father about one thing, but he disagrees about one thing because what did he agree with? So he says savar la kavua b'chada delet le muktzeh v'paliga leb'chada de'ilu avu savar kava en lo kava lo ve'iu savar af al gav de lo kava. That Rabbi Elazar says that I agree with my father that I'm lenient about muktzeh. But my father says it has to extinguish first. And I say, even if it didn't extinguish yet, if the oil drips, the candle's loss is my gain. If it drips out some oil, I get to take it even while it's still lit. He agrees with his father that you can't move that candle. Because if you move the candle, you might extinguish it, and that's a different issue. But
we're allowed to extinguish it if it cannot.
Well, right. We wouldn't want to enter ourselves into a situation where we're risking extinguishing it, so we understand why we can't move it. Right. But if it drips, somehow it cracks, it drips, so that Rabbi Shimon would agree you can't use it because it was part of the candle that was burning. And as long as the candle's burning, whatever oil was a part of it is still a part of it. You can't take from it. But according to his son, Rabbi Elazar, you can take that oil if it drips out, even though the candle is still burning. That's the chidush of Rabbi Elazar. Now the Gemara is going to ask a very important question here, because the end we discussed Rabbi Shimon. Now Rabbi Shimon, it doesn't seem like he should make a difference between quantity, right? If the candle goes out, once it goes out, it's fair game according to Rabbi Shimon for that Shabbat. It's not burning anymore, it's no problem. So now whatever oil is in there, the cup, whatever you want, you can take it.
In other words, it's not even considered muktzah, and you can move it.
You can move it, you can move it, you can use it. You can move it, you can even use the oil if you want to once it's out. While it's lit, any oil associated with that flame is still considered under the rubric of that flame. You can't take it. That's what Rabbi Shimon says. But the question is, why then does it say in this Tosefta, aval kos v'karav ashashit, that a cup or a plate or a large glass with oil, in other words, in those cases you can't move them? Why would Rabbi Shimon make a distinction? I mean, if he holds that once the candle goes out, the oil that's left in there can be used, and it can be moved. So what difference does it make what the size of the receptacle was? So the Gemara asks, Mai shena haneh? What is the reason why these should be any different? Amar Ula. Ula says, Sefatan Rabbi Yehuda. So Ula dodges the question and says, you know what? That last phrase must be Rabbi Yehuda speaking. Because it's not consistent. Rabbi Shimon can't possibly say that that a large cup is different than a small cup. Why would he say a large cup is different than a small cup? Once the flame goes out, he should allow you to use the oil, period. And quantity shouldn't be a factor. So that statement of where it says aval kos v'karav ashashit, that if it's a large cup filled with oil, or a large plate, or a large glass, that it's not allowed to be moved even after the flame goes out, that must have been Rabbi Yehuda speaking, because Rabbi Shimon would never say that. But there's a problem with that, because Matzkifla Mar Zutra says, I hachi mai aval. Then why in the Tosefta does it say but? Right? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, all of these things are prohibited. There's no but. According to Rabbi Shimon, he's saying you're allowed to take the oil from the candle as soon as the candle's extinguished, but you can't take from these kinds of receptacles. But for Rabbi Yehuda, he's saying you can't take from the candle. You wouldn't say but, you would say or anything, right? You can't take from anything. So Ella Amar Mar Zutra, rather Mar Zutra says Olam Rabbi Shimon, it's really Rabbi Shimon. V'chika Sharei Rabbi Shimon Baner Zuta Didate Ilave Aval Haned Nefishela. What is the distinction here? That it is Rabbi Shimon, but he makes a distinction because Rabbi Shimon agrees. Actually, he agrees in principle that lighting a candle is basically the same as saying you don't want that oil. And that's Rabbi Shimon's usual principle. Rabbi Shimon's principle is that stam, anything just ordinary, we assume that you would want to use it on Shabbat, and therefore it doesn't become muktzeh. It's always accessible to you. But Rabbi Shimon agrees that if you push something away and say, I do not want this, I do not want it for Shabbat, I don't want to use it, that it's out of your mind, and out of mind means you can't use it for Shabbat, once you've said it's not for Shabbat. So he would say that a candle that you light that's a small candle, you know it's eventually going to go out. It's not going to last forever. So you know by the next morning you're planning on drinking your tea out of that cup or whatever. but a large one that theoretically could have been lit the entire Shabbat. You were counting on that huge cup burning the entire Shabbat. So when you lit that, even Rabbi Shimon is going to agree, you didn't think it was going to become available to you on Shabbat, and therefore you can't use it, because when you lit it, you were effectively saying, I don't want this. Because you were assuming it was going to burn the whole Shabbat. A smaller candle, we wouldn't apply that. So v'hatanya, we learned in a braita, motar Hashem and shebaner v'sheba ka'ara asur v'Rebbi Shimon matir. But there's a problem, because did we not learn in a braita the additional oil left over in a candle or in a plate cannot be used on Shabbat? Meaning that if the candle goes out early, or you were using a plate or bowl to hold the oil, and the candle goes out, the rabbis say you can't use that oil, because by lighting that oil, you were rejecting the oil and saying you don't want it.
But here,
And Rabbi Shimon says, no, it's motar Hashem and shebaner, means leftover after it burns out.
Well,
Yeah, and Rabbi Shimon says, no, you can use it. But wait a second, you just told me that Rabbi Shimon is the one that says that a ka'ara, that in a large bowl, even Rabbi Shimon is going to agree that you can't partake of the oil after the flame goes out. Why in this braita does it say that Rabbi Shimon says that you can partake of it? So the Gemara gives an easy answer to that and says, Hatam ka'ara dumya dener, hacha ka'ara dumya dekos. Because in that braita, they're illustrating smaller receptacles. Ner, a regular candle, and a small plate, or a small bowl. In our braita that we were talking about, they were talking about large things. Kos v'ashashit are large receptacles. So when it said plate or bowl there, it means a large one. So that's the distinction for Rabbi Shimon. If you're lighting something that you intended to be lit the entire Shabbat, and then it gets extinguished, then you can't use it even according to Rabbi Shimon. If you lit something that you knew was going to become available to you on Shabbat, Rabbi Shimon is lenient. Rabbi Yehuda is stringent for two reasons. The first reason is because he has the concept of muktzeh mechamat isur, that something that was prohibited at any point for you to use on Shabbat is prohibited for the entire Shabbat. And since it was lit on Friday, and it was prohibited according to everyone to handle it while it was lit, so therefore you can't use it for the entire Shabbat, even if it goes out an hour later. And the second reason is because the cup is ma'us, becomes repugnant. Is that the word? Because of the use. Yes?
so Rabbi Yehuda said something designated for Shabbat. That Shabbat or any Shabbat?
When he says in the Mishnah, mitaltalin ner chadash avalo yashan, he means once you've used it, even once on any Shabbat, you can never use it because it's only fit for one thing.
Right.
It's only fit for burning candles. You're not going to take the earthenware receptacle that you burn oil in and drink coffee out of it ever permanently, because the only use of it is to burn. In other words, it's not multi-use anymore. The new candle cup, you could use it for soda first and then use it for oil, but once you've used it for oil, it's going to be disgusting. You're not going to want to use it for anything else. That's what the Mishnah said.
That's on Shabbos? I mean, can you use it next week?
Only on Shabbat. No, you can never. No, once.
Muktzah only applies to Shabbat, right?
Right, of course. Right, so yeah. So if you want to drink out of it during the week, go ahead. But
nobody's really worried about repugnance except on
only on Shabbat, because it's considered that since it's not really multi-use, because you wouldn't use it for anything other than its dirty use, and its dirty use happens to be a non-Shabbat use because it's burning candles. Therefore, you're not going to use it for anything.
Repugnance in Shabbat and dishonoring.
No. It's not because touching it. No.
Usage.
Right, it's usage. Just usage. Yeah, not because you can't touch gross things on Shabbat. You're allowed to touch gross things. Just they have to have a purpose.
As long as they don't smell.
Yeah, as long as they have a purpose on Shabbat that's functional. Now, okay, so now, Amar Rabbi Zera says, Pamot she'edliku bo b'Shabbat l'divrei matir asul l'divrei user mutar. If you used a metal candle, in other words, instead of one of these earthenware vessels, receptacles, you used a metal one. So he says that according to the one that prohibits an earthenware, he would permit. According to the one that permits, he would prohibit. Okay, so the Gemara says, what are you talking about? You're telling me that the one who prohibits you, in other words, if you lit an earthenware candle on Friday, and then Shabbat day, it's out already by the morning. So Rabbi Yehuda would say you can't use it, correct?
The reasoning being that
for two reasons,
that metal doesn't absorb.
So he's saying that because metal doesn't absorb anything, and you can wash it out and use it again for anything. You can use it for your coffee. You can use it for your whatever. So it doesn't become disgusting like the earthenware. So he's saying the one that prohibits because of disgustingness will permit here. the one that permits will prohibit here, but doesn't really seem to be true, because the member the Rabbi Yehuda muktzeh mechamat mius itle is the only issue for Rabbi Yehuda, that it's disgusting. Muktzeh mechamat isur ledle, but the fact that you lit this candle on Friday isn't significant to Rabbi Yehuda. That's not true. V'atani we learned on a bright Rabbi Yehuda omer kol anirot shel Masekhet metaltelin chutz min haner shehidliku bo b'Shabbat. Even Rabbi Yehuda is lenient if this is a metal candle, a metal receptacle used for a candle that wasn't used on this Shabbat. He'll say you could take it and drink soda out of it because it can be clean, then it's no longer disgusting to you. But one that was used on that Shabbat, even he's going to agree you can't use it. So why would they claim that he would permit a metal cup to be used? Answer, rather we sort of misquoted Rabbi Zera here. What he meant to say was this: Amar Rabbi Zera, pamot sheidliku alav b'Shabbat divrei kol asur. That if you lit this metal oil receptacle on Shabbat, everybody will agree that it's not allowed to be used for that Shabbat. However, lo idliku alav, if you didn't use it, divrei kol mutar, everybody will agree that it's allowed because you didn't use it in that particular Shabbat, and it's not ma'us, it's not disgusting because it doesn't absorb the oil, so it shouldn't be a problem. Now, of course, this is presuming that we're talking about because according to Rabbi Shimon, if this particular item was small and wasn't expected to be burning all Shabbat, then he would actually allow you to use it after it finishes burning out. That was what we learned before. So we're talking about, I guess, one that was planned to burn the entire Shabbat. So since you lit it that Shabbat, even if it goes out, Rabbi Shimon is not going to allow you to use it. So, but these are the concepts that they're operating with here. So Amar Rav Yehuda. Amar Rav Yehuda says, Amar Rav, that mitashi yichada lemaot asur letaltala. If you have a little table, or they call it a bed here, but we're talking about a little kind of stand that was used for money. You would put your money on it. This is where you would place your wallet. That's what the purpose of it was. It's designated for that. You can't move it on Shabbat, even if it doesn't have money on it right now, because it's designated for money to be put on it. That's the only purpose of it. Meitve, they raised an objection. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak raised the following objection. We said that you can move a new candle, but not an old candle, and we turn to Amud Bet. Omad ner del hachi avida ki lo hidlik ba sharei letaltula mita. You're telling me that if you have a little bed or a little stand that you are going to use to put money on it, you designated it for putting money on it, even if you haven't used it yet, you're not allowed to move it. But I can show you that that's not true, because if you go get a candle, an earthenware candle, in other words, a receptacle for oil that's used for a candle, even Rabbi Yehuda says you can handle that on Shabbat if it's never been used. And in the case of a little bed, people make beds for all kinds of reasons. You just happen to designate it for money to be put on there. And you're telling me I can't move it just because you designated it? Even though it was made to be multi-purpose. A candle which is clearly made to be lit, and because you want to use it for some other purpose, it's okay. So this doesn't make any sense. It's a contradiction. Because if we're saying that the designated use of something defines what it is, so then a new candle, a new earthenware receptacle that's designed to be used as a candle, should be just as prohibited as a bed which you personally designated to hold money. Actually, it should be even more. It should be even more of an issue, because the bed that you happen to designate, that's just your subjective designation. The candle was definitely designed to be used for lighting a candle. Okay, so how could it be that these two principles, they seem to be in contradiction? So rather, this is the amended form of the statement. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. The Rav Yehuda said that Rav said mitashi yichada lamaot hiniach aleha maot asur letaltela lo hiniach aleha maot mutar letaltela. That if you've used it for money, in other words, you bought a little stand, and you start putting your money on it, okay, or your wallet on it. That's what it's for. It's to put your money next to you, because you're very paranoid. You want to have your wallet right next to your head at night, when you go to sleep. So you put a little stand right next to your bed that's holding just your wallet's right there. So once you've designated it and used it even once, that becomes what it is. Okay, if you designated it and you haven't used it once, just because you said, hey honey, look what I bought, a little table to put my wallet on at night, it doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter that you bought it for that purpose, because you didn't use it yet. But once you used it, it becomes muktzeh. Okay? Now, so then what if you didn't designate it for that, but you happen to want to use it for that? In other words, if you have a multi-purpose little stand, then it's all about what's on it right now. So if you designated it for money and you used it even one time for money, now it becomes muqteh, even if there's no money on it right now, because you designated it for that and you used it for that. If you didn't designate it for holding money specifically, but it's just a random stand, then it depends. If there's a wallet on it right now, you can't move the table because it's serving as a basis, it's serving as a support for a muqteh thing. If there's no money on it right now your rubber ducky is on it, I don't know, whatever, so then you can move it. That's the rule. However, there's one exception. If during twilight, when Shabbat started, that's when everything gets its definition. So if when Shabbat started, sundown was today's sundown is 4:53 or something like that, 4:53. If sundown, yeah. So if at 4:53 there was money on that stand, and it was sitting on there until you got home from synagogue, and now it's 6 o'clock, and you see that there's money on the stand, now even if that gets knocked off, okay, later, the stand itself was a stand for money when the Shabbat started. And because when Shabbat started it was like that, that's it for the whole Shabbat. That's the way that we look at it. Now, this is of course following the view of Rabbi Yehuda. It would seem pretty clear. This is the view of Rabbi Yehuda. There's not the view. Right, just that Shabbat. Right, because you didn't designate it permanently for that. We're talking about just a table that just happened to have that. Okay, so this is why, for instance, if you light candles on a stand, and there's nothing else on the stand on Erev Shabbat, like now you can't use that stand even if the candles go out. Now obviously you can't move the candles themselves, but even if somehow they got knocked off, you wouldn't be able to move the stand either, because it was serving to support the candles during the time of Ben Hashemashot. This is according to Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Shimon, once the wallet gets knocked off, anything goes. Now you can move the stand too, no problem. Okay, so now we say, Amar Ula says, Mativ Rabbi Eliezer, that and this girsa seems to be in error. So let's check what I have at the bottom. No, it isn't. It should say Rabbi Elazar again. Okay, so Mativ Rabbi Elazar said, raised an objection. So Ula reported that Rabbi Elazar raised the following objection. Mukhani shala. This is talking about a wagon. There's a wagon, and there are wheels under the wagon, and the mukhani is the structure under the wagon, the wheel and the axles that attach it. These are removable wheels that these wagons can either carry people or they can carry stuff. Okay, they fit people or things. So bazman shehi nishmetet in chiburla. So in the time that it's removable, in other words, these wagon wheels can be removed from the structure of the wagon. So then they are not. If let's say something impure touches the wagon wheel, it's not going to affect the wagon itself because they're actually separate entities. It can be disassembled. So therefore, it doesn't affect the wagon itself if the wheel becomes tamei, and vice versa. If somehow the wagon itself were to become tamei, that wouldn't necessarily mean the wheel became tamei.
Because they're separable.
Because they're separable, so they don't have the same identity. That's correct. They're not separated, but they're separable. Ve'en nimdedet ima. And it's not counted together with it. What that means is that if an item is the volume of 40 se'ah, in other words, if an item would contain, or would be contained actually, if you would put this into a container of the dimensions of 40 se'ah, which is the minimum of a mikveh, okay? If it were able to fit into a mikveh-sized receptacle, then it itself is not considered to be capable of becoming tameh, because it's no longer considered a portable vessel on its own. Now it happens to be that this vessel is on wheels. This wagon is on wheels. That's why it can roll. But imagine a wagon that big as the minimum size of a mikveh, and you had to carry it with people in it when it's full. It has to be something that's portable even when it's full. And without wheels, it wouldn't be portable, right? The receptacle itself wouldn't be portable. And the measurement that they give to something that is portable or not portable is it the dimensions of a mikveh? Is it the dimensions that would hold 40 se'ah, but including the thickness of the walls? So you have to imagine taking the receptacle part of the wagon and fitting it into a container of 40 se'ah, which is the measurement. It would have to fill it up. Right, the dimensions are of the whole thing. So if it were full with sand, it would fill up that entire area. That's the point. Now, but the wheels don't count towards that measurement. So let's say it's less than 40 se'ah, it's 39 se'ah. But with the wheels, if you count the wheels also, now if you count them, it would fill an area of 40 se'ah. that would not be good. That doesn't exempt it from being mikabel tumah because the wheels don't count. Okay, the wheels don't count towards the wagon size. And you can't. It doesn't save in an oil amet. What this means is, let's say you're riding in a wagon over a cemetery. Now we know that being suspended over a grave is the same as having contact with a dead body, pretty much. In other words, you become tamemet even from being over a grave. That's called ma'ahil alamet, from forming a tent over the grave. In other words, but you yourself are over it. But if you're in a receptacle like this, you're in this wagon. So the wagon itself, the walls of the wagon and the floor of the wagon are interposing between you and the graves underneath as you travel through this. The cemetery. So the question is, what would happen if you're in there, but you didn't realize your bag is hanging over the side? So you might be saved because you're inside the chamber, right? But the bag is not going to be saved because it's hanging over the side. So it's actually hanging directly over the graves. But the only thing is, the wheel is there. So really your bag is hanging over the thickness of the wheel. So you might say, well, just like I'm saved from having this floor underneath me, so too my bag is saved because it's over the wheel. The answer is the wheel doesn't count. So the wheel is not going to be an interposition either, because it's not a separate. It has to be a receptacle that's impervious to tum'ah, and what's impervious to tum'ah is only the wagon itself, but not the wheel. So the wheel is not going to help you save your bag that hung over the side. That's how Rashi interprets it, at least. And if there is money on the wheel. Okay, it kind of reminds me of Wheel of Fortune, It's a Wheel of Fortune, there's money on the wheel. If there's money on the wheel, you can't move the wagon. You can't move the wheel itself, okay? Which means to say that if this were inseparable, in other words, if this were soldered on and you could not remove the wheel from the wagon, it would all be considered one entity and all of these halachot would be different. But because it's separable, because it can be taken apart, it's taken apart and put back together, so that's why they're treated as two separate entities. If they were one entity, all these laws would be different. And even if there were money on the wheel, we wouldn't care because we would look at the majority of the majority of that one entity doesn't have money on it because the wagon doesn't have money in it. Only the wheel does. So, but since the wheel has to be treated separately from the wagon, and we can't invoke the wagon, so to speak, to say that only a tiny part of this is muktzeh, only the wheel. No, because the wheel is separate. It has its own identity. So therefore, we're going to be stringent. But what's the point? Why do they mention this? Because this implies that the only time you can't use the wheel is when there's actually money on it. Okay, but if there were money on it before when Shabbat started and it got knocked off, apparently you could move the wheel. But you just told me that anything that had money on it at the beginning of Shabbat now can't be moved for the entire Shabbat. So what's going on here? So the Gemara says, "Hahi Rabbi Shimon he delete muktzeh." That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon rather. We know that Rabbi Shimon is very lenient. Once the problem, even he wouldn't let you move, let's say, money on Shabbat, because it has no function on Shabbat at all. But once it falls off of that table or once it falls off of that wheel, no problem. V'Rav k'Rebbe Yehuda sviralei, and Rav holds like Rebbe Yehuda, and that's why he's reporting all of these stringent halachot about muktzeh, because he holds that muktzeh does apply. Now we're just going to go a little bit further into Memhei to finish off this point. Hachinami mistabra, and so too is it reasonable to assume that Rav holds like Rebbe Yehuda. The Rav k'Rebbe Yehuda sviralei. Tamar Rav, because Rav said menichin ner al gabe dekel b'Shabbat. Rav said that you can put a candle onto a palm tree on Shabbat. You can rest your lamp. If you're out in the woods, you're camping, and you want to put your Shabbat candles in a place where the squirrels won't knock it over or whatever, you can put it on a palm tree on Shabbat, no problem. But you cannot put it on a tree on Yom Tov. Now, if you hold that if you assume that Rav holds like Rebbe Yehuda, and he's stringent about muktzeh, so then Hainu Dishaneh ben Shabbat the Yom Tov. That's why there's a distinction between Shabbat and Yom Tov. Why? Because on Yom Tov, why can you not put your candle on a tree? Because since you're allowed to move a candle on Yom Tov, because you're allowed to cook and you're allowed to use fire, you're going to go and take that lamp on Yom Tov, and you're going to end up climbing the tree.
But
Or you're
the
going
tree
to...
is muktzeh by itself.
True, exactly. That's the whole point.
So that's right.
In other words, since you can, okay, let me step back. On Shabbat, you put the lamp on the tree, right?
Right.
You can't touch the lamp anymore.
Right.
So it doesn't matter that the tree is muktzeh because you're not going to go touch the lamp anyway. On Yom Tov, when you're allowed to touch the lamp, if you put it on the tree, maybe you're going to also handle the tree. You're going to lean on the tree, you're going to climb the tree. So that's why on Yom Tov you can't put it on there, but on Shabbat you can. Now, according to Rav, that only makes sense if you hold like Rabbi Yehuda. But if you're holding like Rabbi Shimon, then both should be prohibited. Because Rabbi Shimon will say that even on Shabbat, if the candle gets extinguished, now you can take the lamp. So he should tell you, you can never put a lamp on a tree because you might climb up the tree to get your lamp even on Shabbat. Once it gets extinguished, you're allowed to take it down and use it for something else. So what do we see from this? We see that Rav must hold like Rabbi Yehuda. That's why he applies a stringent rule on Shabbat here, on Yom Tov here, and says that you can't put your candle there on Yom Tov, but you can put it on Shabbat. Because on Shabbat, we're not worried that you're ever going to handle the lamp again, because it's muktzeh, because we hold like Rabbi Yehuda, that even if the light goes out, the candle is still muktzeh. There we go. Okay, but wait a second, one last point. V'Rav Rabbi Yehuda Svirale. Is it really true that Rav holds like Rabbi Yehuda? V'haba'umi name de Rav ma'ulital tulei shiragad de chanukta mikame chabare b'shabbatah. They asked, what is the deal? They asked Rabbi Yehuda, can you move the Chanukah candle? It's Shabbat, and the Chabare were a group of Persians who were Zoroastrians, I guess, who didn't allow you to have fire. Either they didn't allow you to put fire in a public place, because they had fire was part of their worship. Part of their worship had to do with fire. So either they didn't allow you to have it outside, and that was the problem, because it was on Chanukah, people would put their Chanukiot outside, and these guys would come and say, you can't have this here. Or even in their house, on certain holidays, they wouldn't allow people to have any flame in their house, because it was an affront to their holiday, where the fire had to only be in their temple. So they would come in and try to make you, hide your candle. You'd have to get your candles out, in a place where they couldn't be seen, basically. So they asked Rav, what would happen if a person lit their Chanukah candle and then there's an emergency, their life is in danger pretty much, or they're in trouble. I wouldn't say that maybe their life isn't in danger, because then it would be a no-brainer. But let's say, they're going to be in trouble in some way or another, because these Chabarim are going to come and they're going to say, you have to move the candle. So what do you do now? Can you move it? So he said, Amar lahu shapir dame. He said, no problem, you're allowed to do it. So shata dachak shane. That since it was an emergency situation, it's different. Amar le Rav Kahana Rav Ashe le Rav, because Rav Kahana and Rav Ashe in the end of that conversation asked Rav Haki Hilcheta, is that really the halacha? Amar lahu, he said to them, Kedayu Rabbi Shimon nismoch alav b'shat dachak, that you can rely on Rabbi Shimon in a case of emergency. So since in this case, apparently the Chanukiah has already gone out, because remember, even Rabbi Shimon won't let you use a candle that's actually lit. It's gone out already, but they're going to come around and see that you had a candle lit and say, hey, I see that you had a candle lit out here, mister, you're in trouble. We're going to take you down to the station. Right? So you say, no, I didn't have a candle lit. So you can bring it inside on Shabbat once the candle has gone out, because we're relying on Rabbi Shimon in an emergency situation, because Rabbi Shimon would say it's okay once the candle has gone out to move it. Rabbi Yehuda would say even after the candle's gone out you can't move it. So even if it's not, right, we're assuming not, because if it's pikuach nefesh, you can do anything. Just trouble, because if it were pikuach nefesh, then for sure, if it's saving your life, you can do anything. Alright, but so we're assuming not. But a situation where you'd be in distress, you'd be in trouble. So he says it's an emergency situation, not a life and death emergency, but a serious situation. We can rely on Rabbi Shimon. But what does we can rely on Rabbi Shimon mean? It means normally we don't follow Rabbi Shimon. Normally we would follow Rabbi Yehuda and say that even after the candle has gone out on Shabbat, we're not allowed to move it. And that's the halakha. That once the candle, pretty much people know that. Once you've lit the Shabbat candle, you can't move it up, obviously, while it's lit. And even after it's gone out, you have to leave it there for the entirety of Shabbat. We're not allowed to move it. Have a great day, everyone. Shabbat shalom.